Hi, so in yesterday's video where I was also talking about Brexit, it's going to be a big topic at the moment. Someone asked, so what does it mean with the no deal then? What happens on March 29th, 2019 with a no deal? So I've gone through 10 important facts to bear in mind with this. So the first one is that there would be no transition period. What the Prime Minister Theresa May has sort of asked for and got tentative agreement from the EU is that on March the 29th, because that won't be enough time for us to set everything up in terms of agreement, that there'll be a transition period where we still sort of operate as if we were part of the EU, only we're not. But it means trade can come and go and all the rest of it. The problem is that would be part of an agreement. There's no formal process of transition period. The transition period is effectively the 2 years from which you trigger Article 50, which has already been done. We're coming towards the end of it. We're more than halfway through. So we do not get that transition period if there is no deal. If there is no deal, then on the 29th of March next year, we are not in the EU. And there is no links with the EU at all. That's it. The second part would then be that World Trade Organization rules will kick in. And this isn't even something the EU can do anything about. You know, this isn't, if we have to use WTO rules and tariffs, because what that means is then there are set tariffs. We all need to be part of the World Trade Organization in order to trade with other countries. We're part of it now. You know, at the moment, of course, we have free trade within the EU. But, you know, we still trade with other countries outside of the EU, and there are tariffs for that. They impose tariffs on our goods. We impose tariffs on theirs. It's all a nice little balance in theory. But that's a deal that came as a result of being in the EU. And it's obviously a better deal than WTO tariffs, because if it weren't, we wouldn't have made that deal. All deals by definition are better than the World Trade Organization tariffs. That's why we make those deals. So we would have to, on any goods and services that we're accessing in this country, we would have to impose those internationally agreed World Trade Organization tariffs, which are very high. And other countries, including the EU, would have to impose them on us. And no one has any say in that. We all agreed as being part of the WTO on that one. So we'd suddenly get those imposed. And as I say, the EU can do nothing about that. If they don't have a separate trade deal with us, which is impossible, by the way, to arrange for March 29th. That's why we needed that transition period to be able to set it up. But in order to get that far, we need a general agreement on what our future relationship is going to be with the EU. And at the moment, we do not have it because Britain is still trying to cherry pick what it wants. And the EU is going, no, because that's you getting your cake, having your cake and eating it. The third thing is that in other countries in the EU at the time, round about the time of the referendum, just before, there were a number of countries who had anti-EU parties of their own rise into prominence. They seem to have largely melted away now. Largely, it is believed, we can't say this is a fact, because of Britain's folly. Everyone in Europe who doesn't have their eyes closed is now seeing that we're basically buggered. You know, we're not getting what we wanted. And they're seeing that, and they're saying, actually, do you know what? Life outside the EU is going to be pretty shitty. And the other thing as well is those countries can stand to gain. There's opportunities there. Because remember, our goods and services are going to be subject to World Trade Organization rules. Well, they're much worse than EU tariffs, which they have arranged across the globe. So that means all of a sudden, our goods and services are more expensive. That gives opportunities for other countries in the EU to be able to effectively undercut us. So goods and services which we sell quite a lot of around the world now, well, maybe there's opportunities there. So we're going to lose a lot of our trade. And that's going to put businesses out of business, and people are going to lose their jobs, of course. The only ones we'll ever be able to hold on to are the ones that can't easily or quickly be done elsewhere as well. You know, we have some decent industries. We have a decent games industry. We have a decent, movie special effects. Some films come over. We have decent special effects studios. Things like that, some scientific research will still trundle on, albeit more expensive, potentially. Depends how it's done. But a lot of things that we make that we're just simply selling a bit cheaper than maybe some of our rivals will all of a sudden be more expensive. And what's that going to do? Plus the fact you've got to bear in mind, any manufacturing that takes place in the UK, if we have to source raw materials from outside of the UK, they're going to be more expensive. So it's not like we can just lower our prices. So the only way we'll be effectively able to lower our prices, we can't do it with tariffs, we can't do it by sourcing cheaper materials, because the materials will become more expensive. All we can do is have a cheaper workforce. That's all we can do. So the job opportunities and stagnant wages that have already been a feature of Britain for some time, it's only going to get worse. So the irony is lots of the people who voted to leave the EU are shooting themselves in the foot. They're putting their jobs at risk. And it's not just putting jobs at risk. Many of those people will lose their jobs because there will not be the trade there to support them. Now, the fourth one, this is a very recent one. The government commissioned a report on, what would happen in the event of no deal. Very sensible thing to do. Of course, you need to work on all sorts of contingencies. And given that it wasn't obvious from the start that there would be an accord, you have to think, well, maybe there will be no deal. So what happens? The government are refusing to publish that report. What is more, obviously a report like this, you can't just ask a few people in a think tank to work it all through. You need to go out and find out a few facts. So there were a lot of business leaders involved in that process. And they were all made to sign non-disclosure agreements. So they can't say what's in the report either. They're keeping this report firmly under wraps. For fear, it is suggested that if the report were to be published, everyone would have it laid bare from the very government that's arguing for a hard Brexit that the country's buggered. The country is absolutely screwed. And then we come on to what some of those hard Brexiteers are actually saying. Now, this, remember this, or you may or may not. So before the referendum, there's a number of people campaigning to leave the EU. And this is what one of them was saying before. Let's just put this on.
Absolutely nobody is talking about threatening our place in the single market.
Because only a madman would actually leave the market.
We'll find ourselves part of the European Economic Area and with a free trade deal.
But to repeat, absolutely nobody is talking about threatening our place in the single market.
So the music there, I clipped this off as someone else who'd prepared this on YouTube. That is what the prominent Leave campaigners were saying before the referendum. They were saying, we'll get to take control of this, that and the other, but we'll still have all the benefits of being the EU, because why the hell wouldn't we? Immediately after the referendum, this is what Nigel Farage was saying.
We voted to leave political union. That means we leave the single market.
So that's what he's been saying since. So I'm not even going to bother to draw attention to the fact that they're clearly lying, because they said one thing before the referendum and the very opposite thing after it, as if they'd never said that other thing before. But what you're now noticing is that a lot of those prominent Leave campaigners are saying very different things now. One of the more prominent ones since, a government, well, not a member of the government actually, but a member of the government's party, backbencher, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who has been basically attacking the Prime Minister whenever she has shown any sort of concession towards the EU at all, which of course is essentially in any deal. You can't just take what you want. This is what he's saying now. He is now saying that it may be 50 years before we see the benefit of this. Now let's lay bare the nonsense of a statement like that. He's not just saying, oh, well, we're not going to see the benefits immediately, which, by the way, is what people like that were saying before the referendum. It's like, immediately that we leave, it's uplit sunlands and all the rest of it. I'm mixing up metaphors there, aren't I? But it's absolutely fantastic. As soon as we leave, all of a sudden, it's going to be brilliant. It's going to be amazing. So here, he's not even saying, oh, it's going to take a few years. There's going to be a few years while we sort everything out. No. By saying 50 years, who can say what the economic state of any nation is going to be 50 years hence? You can't, can you? What he's basically saying is, yeah, the country's going to be screwed, but don't blame me, because eventually we'll get there. Eventually. But in 50 years' time, in 50 years' time, he'll probably be dead if he's not too old and too silly for anyone to bother with him. And the other thing, bear this in mind. All those people who voted in there, are you going to wait 50 years for this mythical paradise that's waiting for us? I'm not going to be around in 50 years, I hope. And nor will most of the people who voted to leave. So they're all, a lot of them are now saying things like this. They're now getting ready. And the reason is because, and you think to yourself, so why would they do this? They didn't want the country to vote to leave. They were victims of their own successful campaign. So why would they campaign for it? To further their own political ambitions. There's a lot of votes to be had in being the contrary speaker, the voice of the opposition, the one who criticises the people who are currently in power. There's a lot of votes, there's a lot of popularity in that area. But the problem is, as soon as you win, you get found out, because now you are the ones, your ideas are going to be the ones who are going to be put to the test, put into practice, and it's like, oh shit. 6, as soon as we leave, if we leave with no deal, immediately, no little transition period, immediately on that date, there have to be checks on goods and people passing across the borders. Now, we already have to do that, of course, when people or goods come from outside the EU. But the vast majority of movement is from within the EU. And so we do not have the border force or customs force to be able to deal with this. And it's not even like the government are currently hiring and training the massive increase that's going to be required. That's what I find strange, given that the government are resisting calls, in fact, never mind resisting, downright slapping down calls for a final vote for the public to say yay or nay. They're going full force on, well, if it's no deal, we'll be fine. And yet, none of the preparation that would be needed for it is there. So that basically means our borders, our ports would be clogged, because there'd have to be checks on loads more stuff, and we don't have the facilities to do it. It's not there. Boris Johnson talked about, we'll use technology for it. What, you might as well say we'll wave a magic wand and get some wizards on there. Technology? What technology? What technology have we got to be able to check on people and goods coming into the country as if by magic? And that technology that he's talking about isn't even there. Even that hasn't been commissioned. So we have nothing in place. We are just going to have clogged ports and borders. And that's going to mean food coming into the country, like fresh food, well, it can't get in quickly enough. It'll go off, so therefore we won't be able to import fresh food. And that causes problems there. And then the other thing, in terms of, because a lot was talked about borders in the referendum, and it seemed to be, you can never tell for certain, because the vote was simply, do you want to leave the EU or not? And there's lots of reasons why people might want to do that. And everyone who voted leave says, well, it's because of this one thing. And everyone who voted for this one reason. Absolute rubbish. But never mind. The other thing that be screwed is the Northern Ireland peace process. So the Good Friday Agreement, which part of it was that there would be no checks at the border. The border patrols would be gone. The border checks would be gone. So basically, people can move between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland freely. Well, that's quite straightforward to do as part of the EU, because it sort of has that anyway. Now, already we've got to bear in mind the Northern Ireland peace process is already on the rocks as it is, because the parties, ever divisive people, aren't getting on. In fact, the devolved government in Northern Ireland hasn't been functional for some time. So something like this, should we put it this way, there's no sense that there's going to be a willingness on all sides to work through it if we don't get a deal. There is none at all. A huge, massive political issue will be made of this. And I wouldn't necessarily blame them either. Some people may well see the Good Friday agreement as being null and void, because a central plank of it cannot exist. You know, we can. It's not even like we can independently say, "Oh well, let's just allow the free trade there," because the EU would have to demand that the Republic of Ireland has checks on stuff leaving the UK, which is Northern Ireland, into the Republic of Ireland. Without a deal, that whole process is going to kick off. And the other thing as well is, again, people talked about, oh, we're going to do it so we can control our borders, because people say, well, this free trade, you know, this free movement of people within the EU means people from the EU can just come into our country and take our jobs. Blah, 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 blah. Forgetting the fact that they're doing the jobs that either we can't be asked to do. I mean, that's another thing that's going to hit food, which I'll talk about next, is that a lot of Eastern European people have come to this country, and there's actually fewer of them doing it now because it's not really worth it. Doing hard graft, picking vegetables in the morning, back-breaking work for not much money. There's local people out of work that won't do it. And the other thing is doing jobs for which there are skills. We just don't have enough of those skills in this country. You know. But our biggest problem is not that. Our biggest problem is illegal immigration from outside of the EU. And far from taking back control of our borders, we'll lose control. You know, at the moment, a lot of people coming into the EU will be looking for a better life. But you can't just do that. You can't just decide you're going to leave one country to join a poor country to join another one because, you know, you think it'll be better for you. So the only way you either come in illegally, well, that problem's not going to be solved, or you try and claim asylum. You try and claim that you're fleeing persecution. So then, of course, you need processing, checking, stuff like that. Now, the rules in the EU are wherever you present yourself, that's the country where you have to be processed. Now, it doesn't mean to say that you have to stop there. Obviously, the EU is not stupid. We understand that in some countries are going to get the bulk of asylum seekers. So they're once processed, distributed fairly, as long as their claims are verified. Otherwise, it's like, no, you're just coming in because you want a free ride. So we know that there's a lot of people who come to the EU but specifically want to come to Britain because it's seen as a soft touch. Not quite true, but it's seen as that. So you get a lot of people that get stopped at France, for example, at Calais. And the French are duty bound to prevent those travelling into the UK. But they won't be. Remember, France don't want those people cluttering up their border any more than we do on the other side. So outside of the EU, and the British government have tried saying things like, oh no, but that's a separate agreement. France doesn't see it that way. It's done it as part of its obligations as part of the EU. Now, if we want France to continue to do that work, which remember will be politically difficult for them because it's not popular in Calais, the people of Calais don't like these camps. We're going to have to pay for it, and we already pay a little bit, you know, to help out. We're going to have to pay a lot because we're not just going to have to pay to compensate them for their costs because they're not going to shell any money to it. We're going to have to compensate them for the political inconvenience, which basically means effectively bribing the locals, you know, with maybe trade or something like that. It's going to be a huge expense. Or we just say to France, we'll sort it, and then we have to deal with them on the other side. So we actually lose control of our borders. So that's nonsense. Now, 9, biggie, is that the cost of goods will immediately increase. It's not just about those World Trade Organization tariffs that are going to be slapped on. That immediately will raise the cost of goods. There's other things as well. Like I've already said, it's very difficult for us to import fresh food at this point because we don't have the capacity to get the checks done quickly and efficiently and get stuff through. That's going to be a real problem. So food wastage. And of course, you know, at the other end, someone's got to pay for it. And if we, you know, it might be that some organisations decide not to bother trying to export fresh food to us. So there's the extra cost there as well, that just caused by scarcity, the fact that there won't be as much food. We can't just grow enough of our food. We import a massive amount of food, huge amount. Even in the Second World War, where we were pressed again, you know, we were right up against it in terms of being able to import food. The only way we got through that was 1, enforced and severe rationing. 2, encouraging people to grow their own vegetables in their own gardens. And 3, we still had to import stuff. You know, we still needed to import stuff, otherwise we'd have been buggered. and we've got a much larger population now. So, and of course, remember, everything feeds into it. So not only have we got a much larger population, and we've never been able to feed ourselves for like 1,000 years, but also, well, a few hundred years at any rate, also there's the extra cost because of wastage of food as it waits to be processed at the borders. But also, like I've already said, we don't have people to physically pick what vegetables we do have in our fields to physically pick them. Farmers have already noted that there are not as many people coming from in the EU. They rely on EU labour because local labour will not do it. The local people will not do it. It's back-breaking work, long hours, not much pay. They can't be asked. So those and there'll be even fewer of them. I mean, basically none of them, really, if you think about it. So even the food we can grow, we won't be able to get it to the supermarket shelves because there's no bugger to pick it. Completely screwed. And we've already got an awful lot of people now in the UK that are below the breadline, even working families that are reliant upon food banks. That number's just going to explode. Even the government have talked about the jams, what they call jams, families that are just about managing. Well, just about managing, food prices go up a little bit, and you can't staple foods as well. We're not talking the price of caviar is going to go up. You know, it will, but staple foods, they're going to go up as well. You can't get out of that. It's not a luxury, but certain foods that are considered staple foods might become a luxury. And what's going to happen to those families now? The lid's just going to get blown off that. And then the final one, number 10, well, it's not really final, but of the 10 that I sort of thought were most important, the NHS is buggered. We've already noted that the NHS cannot get enough nurses. We get a lot of our nurses from overseas, in particular from the EU. The numbers of nurses from the EU coming to Britain have already reduced because those people don't know what their status is going to be like. They go into a country, they don't know if they're going to be kicked out, they don't know if they're going to be losing certain rights. They don't know what the situation is. They feel in limbo. So they're staying in their own country. They're staying in the EU at any rate, shall we say, because their future is then more secure. And even though we've sort of said, look, we want to guarantee the rights of EU citizens to live and work in the UK freely as long as it's reciprocated across the border, and both sides are sort of fine with that. They're both okay with that as long as it's reciprocated. Unless it forms part of a deal, it cannot be enacted. There can be no nod and a wink about this. Any arrangements that are made between the EU and the UK outside of the EU have to be formalised in a deal. If there's no deal, that doesn't happen. And people know that it's looking likely there'll be no deal. And so those people are just not coming over. The NHS has already been saying that it's had to cut services just due to not enough staff and their rota. They cannot, and a lot of nurses that are there are being now overworked. So there's also nurses, British-based nurses, that are leaving the NHS because it's too much work, because they're being overworked. And the situation is already desperate and will get worse because there may be some people who are thinking, well, surely a deal will become. Surely it's in everyone's interest that some sort of deal emerge. And for all the Conservatives talk about no deal is better than a bad deal, actually, no, it probably isn't. And that will not just slow down the number of nurses we're able to attract from the EU, but stop it completely. And we don't train up enough nurses ourselves. There's not enough people who see it as a suitable career because it's known that they're overworked and potentially underpaid as well. And of course, it takes several years to train. So, even if that trend is reversed, we get more people from the UK going into nursing several years before we get the benefit. And as I say, at the moment, there's nothing being done to make it look like an attractive prospect. The government keeps saying, oh, we're going to raise the wages of people in the public sector now. But there's no more money for it. So that money's coming out of budgets. So what basically means is they're going to be worked even more because there's not enough money. That money's been taken from elsewhere in services. So it actually means you've got fewer staff. We'll pay the staff a bit more, but you'll have fewer, obviously. You'll have to work harder for it. And they're already overworked. So those are my 10 sort of facts about what happens in the event of no deal. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, comments down below, of course. Don't forget to like, subscribe for further content. Until next time, I'll see you later.